Good morning to everyone tuning in from the United States, and good evening to all of our audience members joining from Korea. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'd really like to thank you for joining us again for the second day of our 2020 Atlantic Council Korea Foundation Forum. Yesterday, on the first day of this year's forum, we had the honor of hosting Kurt Campbell, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and Chairman and CEO of the Asia Group, for keynote remarks, as well as an outstanding group of other distinguished experts and former senior officials from both the US and Korea, who projected the path ahead for the US-ROK alliance under the incoming Biden administration. Our discussions touched on a broad range of strategic issues facing the alliance in this decade, including US-China competition, tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the role of emerging technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, ongoing shifts in the regional trade architecture, and quite a bit more. Today, we will take a deeper dive into two sets of strategic issues facing the alliance with another great group of leading US and Korean experts and current and former officials. Our first panel will assess the future of efforts to denuclearize North Korea under the Biden administration in light of President-elect Biden's calls for principled diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula. We'll find out a bit more about what that means, what that might mean. Our second discussion will take us beyond the peninsula for a closer look at how US and Korean economic cooperation is playing out in key regions such as Southeast Asia, and how the alliance is responding to important economic issues such as emerging technologies, global supply chain diversification, particularly amidst the COVID pandemic, signs of US-China decoupling, and quite a bit more. I'll leave to our moderators to properly introduce our distinguished group of speakers, but suffice to say that I am eager to hear their cutting-edge analysis and actionable recommendations for the US-Korea alliance and the economic partnership. This forum continues to serve as a key platform for the Scowcroft Center's growing Asia Security Initiative to help further the Scowcroft Center's mission of honoring General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service, embodying his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for US leadership in close cooperation with allies, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. I'd like to close by again thanking our great colleagues at the Korea Foundation, including President Lee Gyun, for helping arrange this year's forum. And I want to remind our audience that today's event is on the record and open to the public. Please submit any questions through the Q&A function on Zoom or at the hashtag on Twitter, hashtag ACKF. For those of you on Zoom, please keep a close eye on the chat for the link to today's second session after this first panel. And so with that, I'd like to pass things over to someone who needs no introduction, Dr. Sumi Terry, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Korea Chair. She'll be running today's really interesting first panel discussion. Dr. Terry, over to you.
Good morning to everyone joining us from Washington, and good evening to everyone joining us from Seoul. My name is Sumi Terry, and I'll be moderating this morning's panel on principled diplomacy for a denuclearized North Korea with distinguished colleagues. We have on this panel, first, Mr. Robert Einhorn, Senior Fellow for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiative and the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, both housed within the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. We have Dr. Kyung-Hyun Kim, Professor in the Department of Economics from Seoul National University. We have Marcus Galaskas, non-resident Senior Fellow for Asia Security Initiative at Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council and former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea. And last but not least, Dr. Ki Young-sung, Senior Research Fellow at the Security Strategy Center, Research Center at Institute for National Security. So let's get started. I would like to start with our American panelists first, and starting with you, Bob, if that's okay. Overall, I guess my overarching question is, how do you assess last 4 years of US-North Korea relations under the Trump administration? Have we made any kind of progress, meaningful progress, or any progress, or are we caught in the same old cycle with the Kim regime? Ultimately, what are the major lessons that the incoming Biden administration should take from the last 4 years? Has the risk of conflict increased or decreased? Is time on the US side, or as Kim Jong-un said himself, on the side of North Korea? Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Sumi, and thanks to Barry and the Atlantic Council for organizing this forum. One of the innovative features of the Trump administration diplomacy on North Korea is to engage at the summit level. This is understandable given the North Korean system. The only significant decision maker is the guy at the top, Kim Jong-un. And so engaging at that level has some advantage. And I think this opened up opportunities for the Trump administration. But unfortunately, I think these opportunities were squandered for a number of reasons. I think there was an over-reliance on personal diplomacy and overconfidence by President Trump that the force of his personality could overcome some significant substantive differences. I think there were unrealistic demands by the United States for early and complete denuclearization. I think on the North Korean side, there was overconfidence in their ability to persuade Donald Trump to do what they wanted. This was most evident at the Hanoi summit, where I think probably Kim Jong-un's advisors told him that President Trump was so eager for a deal, they would accept a one-sided proposal. So I think some of the real opportunities were squandered. So what lessons for the Biden administration? One, the most obvious one is don't over-rely on personal diplomacy. I think probably President Biden would be prepared at some stage to engage at the level of leaders, but he'll want to make sure that before such a meeting, that the working level had made a lot of progress. And I think President Biden would agree to engage with Kim Jong-un if he believed that only meeting at the leaders level could break through on remaining issues. Another lesson, I think, is don't over-rely on sanctions pressure. The Trump administration maximum pressure campaign did, in fact, put a lot of economic pressure on North Korea. But over time, that pressure began to wane. North Korea is an expert at sanctions evasion. And so some of the very harsh and strong UN sanctions began to dissipate in the leverage they provided. And unfortunately, both China and Russia have become increasingly complicit in North Korea's sanctions evasion. So don't over-rely on sanctions. And perhaps the most important thing is have a realistic understanding of how much leverage you have and what you can achieve, what goals can be achieved with the available leverage. There was a significant amount of leverage that the Trump administration had on at its disposal, but I think by seeking early and complete denuclearization, it was seeking goals that could not be achieved with available leverage. And I think perhaps later in our discussion, we'll go into what would be a realistic goal that the United States could have, that the Biden administration could have with the leverage available to it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Same initial question to you, Marcus. What are important takeaways for Washington from the last 4 years? What worked, what has not? North Korea has today amassed 20 to 30 nuclear warheads and they continue to churn out fissile material. And you've seen during this much anticipated October 10th parade, which celebrated the 75th anniversary of the ruling Workers' Party of Korea, North Korea paraded these two massive new sea and ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this new long-range strategic weapon is believed to be the world's largest ICBM, big enough to carry multiple warheads. So has the risk of conflict increased? And Bob just talked about leverage. Maybe perhaps Washington's leverage has decreased. But what does it all mean for U.S. and South Korea's national security? And again, key question, is time on the side of the United States or North Korea? Marcus.
Sue, thank you very much. These are really important questions, and there's a lot to unpack. So I really like what Bob had to say. So I'll focus on the issue of whether time is on our side and where we see the risks going. I think the risks have dramatically increased, and I don't think the time is on our side now. But I do think it's important to explore a little bit more about why and how we got here, because I think there's some misperceptions. I don't think this is something that happened just over the course of a single presidential term or just in the last couple of years. So although, I'm going to be drawing on my experience in government, I just want to emphasize, of course, what I have to say. The usual caveats doesn't imply endorsement by the ODNI, the IC, or any government agency. But I think it's important to look at this broader arc. So there was this long period, perhaps from the fall of the Soviet Union up until probably about 2015, where it at least looked like that time was on our side in dealing with North Korea. And it was understandable why we could think that. This was when North Korea was dealing with the collapse of its economy, the Great Famine and its aftershocks. And there was a lot of conventional wisdom at the time, remember in the aftermath of the fall of the Iron Curtain, that North Korea's form of government just couldn't last. And perhaps most importantly, it also seemed at the time that China was becoming more frustrated with North Korea and more closely aligned with the US and South Korea in terms of how to deal with North Korea's nuclear program. And so Kim Jong-Il's health declined, and many assumed that this was the beginning of the end of the regime because it couldn't survive the transition to a new leader. There was an underestimation of Kim Jong-un, maybe that he couldn't keep the regime intact afterwards. But as Kim Jong-un successfully consolidated power, North Korea adapted its sanctions evasions and rolled out measures and rolled out the Byungjin policy. By 2015, many of us came to openly question this idea, this conventional wisdom that time was on our side, not Kim's. And then, of course, we see the accelerated weapons testing in 2016 and 2017. And during the period of the last year of the Obama administration, the first year of the Trump administration. And the tremendous progress that these tests demonstrated, including 3 nuclear tests of dramatically increasing yield, 3 ICBM launches, and dozens of shorter range ballistic missile launches. And this really rightfully fueled a very public sense of worry that time was no longer on our side and that we're essentially headed in the wrong direction for a collision. And I'm sure all of us on this call really remember in 2017 this tremendous sense of crisis and urgency that was often playing out, of course, in 24/7 news cycle. But in 2018, of course, that sense dissipated with those opportunities and that engagement at the highest level that Bob mentioned. And so as a result, there was this once again comfortable sense that, time is on our side. Talks are underway, missile testing had stopped, and the sectoral sanctions that Bob referred to were starting to come into force. So there was this sense, we can scale back our military exercises, we can afford to be patient. Well, this proved, of course, to be an illusion. Rather than the effects of sanctions accelerating, again, as Bob mentioned, momentum ended up going in the opposite direction. China's easing off, and then North Korean sanctions evasion was kicking into gear. And North Korea used the breathing space that started in 2018 to adapt. And Kim, even while this was going on, was ordering mass production of the new missile systems that had been tested in 2017, very public order. So Kim's stubbornness at the Hanoi summit in February 2019, that of course Bob referred to, and what we've seen since then really should have shattered any illusions that time is on our side. North Korea had resumed ballistic missile testing in 2019, even as maximum pressure collapsed, and even as U.S.-South Korean military exercises were scaled back. Even with the tremendous economic effects of a COVID lockdown, typhoons, and floods, North Korea is persevering. The new equipment in the October parade that you referred to, Sue, and you can see the monster ICBM, so-called, behind me from the parade, that picture. It shows that the sanctions are not having the desired effect. The programs are advancing, production is continuing, even without ICBM flight tests or nuclear tests. Meanwhile, the trends from China have also clearly been in the wrong direction. China's been allowing massive sanctions violations, been propping up the regime through this COVID crisis, and even been obstructionist at the UN just on reporting sanctions violations. And then, of course, in a broader sense, it's becoming more confrontational toward the US and blatantly trying to pressure and U.S. allies, not just South Korea, but of course, most recently we've seen what's been going on with Australia. So the trends really mostly point in the wrong direction, right? They keep going up. The risks keep going up, and so we've got not just a qualitative increase in North Korea's capability, but Sue, as you mentioned, a quantitative increase. The estimates that you can see in various open sources are around a half a dozen weapons worth of fissile material per year. That adds up pretty fast. Okay, so we're talking about a couple dozen warheads worth of fissile material just in the last couple of years. So if things escalate now to a full-scale war, unlike where we were a decade ago, dozens of nuclear weapons could come into play, could be used. And this is a huge increase in the level of risk that we're facing. And meanwhile, China is increasingly problematic. There's a real risk of confrontation brewing, I think, with China over North Korea issues. And though I think North Korea is having a tough time economically, it's adapting, and it's hard to say that once the COVID lockdowns are over, that the sanctions effects will increase rather than decrease over time. And for the sake of argument, even if the effects of sanctions do build up, that's not necessarily good news from a risk perspective if that destabilizes this regime that is going to remain stubbornly nuclear armed and that would rather use nuclear weapons than go quietly. So I think we're at a really precarious moment. It could be possible to get time back on our side, but this isn't easy or certain. It's not guaranteed. And it'll probably be even harder to convince Kim that time is not on his side. Of course, he said again at the parade, the time is by our side. But more important, I think, than worrying about whether or not time is on our side at this particular moment, I think we've got to focus on what we can do to manage and mitigate the risks that have grown by leaps and bounds, and particularly the risk of miscalculation that could lead to a nuclear war. So it's important to try and get time back on our side and slow the growth of the threat, but we've also got to manage these risks that have just mushroomed over the last few years. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcus. Before we talk about how we do that, minimize the risks, Professor Kim, if I can bring you in here, you just heard from Bob and Marcus. Marcus just said time is not on Washington's side and sanctions are not having a desirable effect. But so given this, what is North Korea's next move? While advancing nuclear missile program, at the same time, and Marcus alluded to this, North Korea seems to have experienced this year and experiencing an unprecedented combination of crises, including dealing with impact of sanctions still, COVID-19 pandemic, economic crisis following the closure of the cross-border trade due to the pandemic, and then not to even mention the typhoons and floods and so on. So even as North Korea is qualitatively and quantitatively increasing its nuclear missile program, as Marcus talked about, does all this domestic trouble also mean that North Korea is still maybe desperate for sanctions relief and thus more likely to tread carefully than before? Or will it give North Korea a greater incentive for provocations to get on the Biden administration's radar, and which is their typical MO anyway, reverting to provocations, to try to force the incoming U.S. administration to make concessions? They've done it before when Obama came in and also President Trump. So, and then there's just one more. I think there was a report last week that South Korean intelligence officers told lawmakers that Kim Jong-un is all stressed out over the pandemic, ailing economy, and is hesitant to provoke President Biden. What do you think North Korea's moves are in the coming months? You might be on mute.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Sumi. That's a great question. I think that Kim Jong-un's options are very limited because there is substantial risk associated with either of the cases. The risk adoption of treading carefully is that the Biden administration may put the North Korea issue a low priority. Then Kim Jong-un's concern is how long the economy is able to endure this hardship. North Koreans nowadays make most of income from market activities and thus become more independent of the state. They demand improvement in their welfare more actively than before, say in the 1990s. This will be significant pressure on Kim Jong-un politically. An option of military provocation is not easy either. Although it can help to attract attention from the Biden administration and increase the rank of priority attached to North Korea issues, a likely consequence will be that the sanctions get tougher. Moreover, this may undermine North Korea's relations with China, which is afraid of destabilization in the Korean Peninsula, and thus may subsequently reduce economic assistance and impose sanctions more tightly. This will cause greater pain to the economy, which already hit very hard. I once described Kim Jong-un as a bird in a cage. He can sing a song freely, but what he can do is very limited. This is the consequence of the multilateral sanctions and their effects on the economy, now reinforced by the COVID-19. In this regard, he could choose initially a verbal provocation rather than actual one to see a response from the United States. From the US perspective, it is better to give a signal to North Korea before next year's Eighth Party Congress that the Biden administration is prepared for negotiations with North Korea at any time when it is ready. This can help to decrease the probability of Kim Jong-un taking the option of military provocation. For this, the United States administration may consider appointing a special envoy on North Korea issues before all relevant government posts are filled. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Song, same question to you. Professor Kim says Kim's moves are actually pretty limited. Do you agree with his assessment? What should we expect from North Korea? Professor Song? Dr. Song?
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much, Sumi. Yes, I do agree with the most of the explanations by Professor Kim Byung-yeon. As we see, North Korea has been very silently watching the power transition in the United States. North Korean state media did not even react to Joe Biden's pretty insulting charge against Kim Jong-un, such as a thug or a dictator during the campaign. I think the silence in Pyongyang, in a way, implies its anxiety coming from the possible end of the top-down diplomacy, which Kim Jong-un preferred. Obviously, I think Chairman Kim Jong-un was very disappointed with the failure of President Trump's re-election, simply because no president in American history treated the North Korean leader better than Trump over the last 2.5 years. But North Korean leadership now begins to realize the tough reality of what is going to happen during the Biden administration. President-elect Joe Biden and State Secretary nominee Tony Blinken kept criticizing Kim Jong-un himself and his summit diplomacy with President Trump. It signals the Biden administration will not pursue a top-down diplomacy anymore, and at the same time, they will not recognize Kim Jong-un as a reliable counterpart until North Korea shows credible evidence for its denuclearization commitment. It will bring about a damaging effect to Kim Jong-un's foreign policy, in which he wanted to earn more time for economic survival by achieving sanction relief in exchange for a small step of denuclearization action. Nevertheless, I guess North Korea's silence will continue at least until January next year. I see two pretty different signals from the silence in North Korea. First, North Korea's top priority now is domestic rather than foreign policy, as other speakers mentioned. In the Party Congress in January, it is expected that North Korea will announce a new version of the so-called self-rehabilitation with 5-year economic development plan. At the same time, with the feeling of crisis coming from the COVID-19, North Korea's policy priority is still control of the pandemic, which is a very dire threat to the regime security itself in North Korea. The second impression from the silence is, I guess, that what Pyongyang has in mind at the moment with regards to the diplomacy with the United States is simply to start off, resume negotiation with the United States by reconfirming the Singapore Agreement. The 4 elements of the Singapore Agreement contains most of the bilateral negotiation agenda between the United States and the DPRK. So if the Biden administration shows a willingness to recognize the key elements or key spirits of the agreement, North Korea has no reason to exacerbate the situation at this point. So it is reasonable to predict North Korea will be refraining themselves from launching military provocations around Biden's inauguration. Instead, they are expected to wait and see how the Biden administration's North Korea policies is going to be shaped. Thank you.
Before I get to Bob and Marcus about the Biden administration's policy going forward, let me just ask a follow-up question to you, and then maybe Professor Kim can also comment if he wishes, about South Korean views here. I think it's important to understand South Korea's perspective, their concerns and priorities. What are they expecting in terms of with the incoming Biden administration? Can you just give us a little bit of a South Korean perspective in all this?
There are some pretty popular misinterpretation of the Biden administration North Korea policy, I think. Some people say that the Biden administration's policy will end up becoming the so-called the strategic patience 2.0. And other people say that the policy must not be the third Obama presidency, but it should be the third Clinton presidency, expressing their high hope for the more proactive engagement with North Korea than the Trump administration. I think we need to avoid these two extreme pessimism and optimism. Instead, we will need to figure out a smarter and more creative engagement strategy than the Trump administration. Therefore, as Professor Kim mentioned, I think now is the time for both parties to minimize actions and languages that are likely to stimulate each other. North Korea needs to give up a familiar pattern of military actions to buy attention from the President of the United States. And also, I would like to suggest to go back to Singapore Agreement, not to the Hanoi Summit. I see, as I said, I see no reason to deny the core element of the Singapore Agreement for both parties. It is a reasonable starting point. If you look at the Kim Yo-jong statement in July, what North Korea emphasized is that they expect resumption of the US DPRK negotiation in exchange for the withdrawal of hostile policy from the United States. The connotation of the hostile policy is very wide and very complex, but at least at this point, exchanging a goodwill gesture between Washington and Pyongyang will be an essential part of productive diplomacy, not to repeat the mistake of the first year of the Obama administration.
Thank you. Professor Kim, did you want to make a comment on South Korea's perspective, or?
Well, just briefly, that well, the government seems to prefer the early negotiations than late ones, and which can help the peace process the government wants to pursue as soon as possible. So that is what the government prefers.
So, Bob, you mentioned earlier that there were unrealistic expectations from both Washington and Pyongyang. President-elect Biden's nominee, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, a strong critic of the Trump administration's approach to North Korea, has advocated now a multilateral diplomatic efforts and a step-by-step approach. He wrote in June 2018 in New York Times piece that the best model for a nuclear deal with North Korea is actually JCPOA, the deal with Iran. Should we expect the Biden administration to pursue a similar deal with North Korea? What would it look like, given that North Korea already has nuclear weapons? You know, Marcus gave a good layout on this. What do you think about the counter view, though, expressed by more skeptical folks that would be giving, you know, North Korea, it's like accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. And North Korea is also, there's going to be a problem with verification. It's going to be unlikely to admit international inspectors in for any kind of agreement. You know, what's your take on this, either step-by-step approach or potential interim deal with North Korea?
Thank you, Sumi. First, let me just comment on some of the things that have been said. I don't think President Biden is going to want to rush into diplomacy with North Korea. He has other priorities, domestic priorities. He has other foreign and national security priorities, and there'll be certain hesitation to take on a problem that's proved so intractable in the past. So I think the Biden administration will take its time. And of course, part of what the Biden administration will want to do early on is to reassure our East Asian allies, South Korea and Japan, about the US security assurances. Confidence in those assurances, I think, has been undermined by President Trump's transactional approach to alliances. The problem is, the risk is that Kim Jong-un will see the Biden administration taking its time and will reach the conclusion that maybe North Korea is a low priority for the Biden administration. And is being ignored by the Biden administration. As others have pointed out, this leads to a risk that North Korea could engage in provocation in order to get the attention of the world. And so what should the Biden administration do? I think what it should do, and I think both Dr. Kim and Dr. Sung mentioned this, early on in its administration, the Biden administration should express an interest in engaging with North Korea. First, it's got to get its administration settled, and that could take months, but to indicate a willingness eventually to engage. And I think Dr. Sung is absolutely right. A Biden administration statement that the United States is prepared to support the framework that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump agreed at Singapore would be a very good signal. It's actually a very good framework. Peace and stability, better US DPRK relations, denuclearization. It's a good framework. And I think indicating that would be reassuring to Kim Jong-un, and an indication that the Biden administration was simply not dismissing what he considers to be an important accomplishment. Another piece of unsolicited advice: don't refer to Kim Jong-un as a thug anymore. In their system, that's a red line you really must not cross. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. About your question, Sumi, on what the Biden team should do. I think the Biden team will be realistic enough to know that Kim Jong-un really has no intention of giving up nuclear weapons completely, at least certainly not in an agreed time frame or at a price that the United States and its allies would be willing to pay. And that's why I think Tony Blinken had talked about a step-by-step approach. I think that's the only realistic approach. It's not giving up the goal of complete denuclearization. It's not accepting North Korea as a permanent nuclear armed state. But it's saying that this is a long-term goal that has to be achieved step by step. And I think the Biden administration, in my view at least, should concentrate on a first step. You can call it an interim agreement. Interim meaning it's temporary. It's not forever, but it's a step toward the goal of complete denuclearization. And I think the key thing is what should be the content of that initial agreement, that interim agreement. In my view, it should formalize the current de facto moratorium on nuclear testing and testing of long-range missiles. And it should also ban the production of fissile material. And if you ban the production of fissile material, then you put a cap on the amount of nuclear material that's available for your nuclear arsenal. So I think these would be important constraints. I think that Marcus could go into much greater detail than I could about the implications of those constraints. But I think this would be an important step. And at the same time as reaching this kind of an interim agreement, there would have to be a commitment to continue negotiations, to further steps toward the goal of complete denuclearization. Now, I know that there would be skeptics, about this. Will the North Koreans fulfill their obligations? Will they cheat? Will they pull out of the deal when it suits their interests? That's part of the risk of dealing with North Korea. But I think one has to ask oneself, do we want the momentum of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs to continue? Marcus made a very strong case. We need to break that momentum. And this kind of an interim agreement would break that momentum. And a very important benefit of breaking that momentum, it would put the United States and its allies in a stronger position to counter those programs. We could develop better defenses, better means of deterring, missile defense capabilities, other capabilities, and we could do it more cheaply than if the North Koreans continue to expand their capabilities. So I think it's important to pursue an interim agreement while emphasizing that the interim agreement is not the end of the story. We need to continue after that to move to complete denuclearization. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. You mentioned that the Biden administration will be prioritizing initially all the domestic issues, economic renewal, climate, racial divide. There's so much going on that they might not be prioritizing North Korea, except that North Korea is not going to just wait forever. So I think, before he knows it, he will have to turn to North Korea. So before we get there, before any kind of provocation happens, we need to have a plan. Marcus, what's your take on Bob's response? North Korea is now in possession of arsenal that is more advanced than ever before. And President Biden, I think Wall Street Journal noted that President Biden will be the first American president to enter office since North Korea demonstrated it has a missile capable of hitting US mainland. What's your take? Does this mean that the Biden administration will need to explore, as Bob said, whether even without a comprehensive agreement on denuclearization, it would be in the interest of the United States to pursue a more measured interim agreement, objective of arms control, basically, where the goal is to freeze and put a cap on North Korea's nuclear weapons program? Is it time to pursue an interim freeze deal, which seeks to, as you mentioned, to qualitatively and quantitatively limit North Korea's weapons capabilities to manage the problem? Marcus.
Sue, thanks. I think this is really one of the central elements about what we have to think about in terms of policy and strategy going forward. And particularly, we got to have realistic goals and realistic assumptions. And so I think the idea that Bob lays out, the general premise of having some near-term negotiating goals without giving up on a much longer-term principled goal of North Korean denuclearization, I think that basic idea makes sense. But I keep hearing the word interim, and I think it worries me a bit that we might kind of become victims of our own terminology and be trapped by our own premise. what may be interim to us is probably not going to be interim to Pyongyang. Because as the U.S. intelligence community has noted repeatedly on the record, I think we're all well aware that the view has been that North Korea doesn't plan to negotiate away its nuclear weapons at this point. But as Dr. Sung had mentioned, they're trying to make some kind of partial concession to us to get some relief. So to Pyongyang, an interim deal is just really intended to get enough relief so that they can basically they can go back to business as usual, right? So this means that the first step in any kind of step-by-step approach, although it may be intended to lead to destination from our perspective, it may not be intended to go beyond that first step from North Korea's perspective. And that first step has got to be worth the price that we're willing to pay for it, because the next step may not come for a long time or if ever. And that's why I focus so much in my writing, and as Bob has alluded, on this idea of a freeze, a halt to strategic weapons testing. And I think we might need to think about going beyond just long range ICBM tests and recognize ballistic missile testing is a violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and tolerating the sort of testing that North Korea resumed in 2019, that's not necessarily something that we want to do either. And we have to be careful not to set the bar where now anything below a long range missile is okay. So I think the advantages of a freeze on testing is it stops the qualitative advancement, it stops the improvement of the reliability and the credibility of the arsenal in particular. And it's fairly easy to verify, and it's really not that intrusive to implement. We can watch from a distance whether or not North Korea is firing missiles. We can tell from the seismic readings whether or not North Korea has conducted an actual underground nuclear test. So if you want to go beyond that, though, a deal that involves North Korea, say, shutting down part of the Yongbyon complex and allowing access to it, that might also be realistic. That's similar to what Kim put on the table at Hanoi, and that may reemerge. But the price for this sort of thing would naturally be higher, and the price that Kim asked at Singapore, of course, at Hanoi was not one that was going to be beneficial to us. My former deputy, her well, of course, Jung Pak, rightly called Kim's offer of the Yongbyon trade for major sanctions relief as being a grossly disproportionate trade, and I agree with that characterization. And then once you go beyond that to a comprehensive freeze of all fissile material production, this sounds, in theory, a lot more realistic than total denuclearization in a short time frame, but it's still a very tall order. And I really don't think Pyongyang wants to go there. This would have to include new declarations by Pyongyang of facilities that it's never talked about before. It would have to include intrusive verification measures that would go beyond Yongbyon to facilities that had, again, never been declared by North Korea, not even acknowledged. So I think a comprehensive freeze is still not a realistic near-term goal, but a halt to testing, a continued halt, I think is realistic. I think it's worth the price. But the question is Kim going to be willing to go there for a price that we hope he'd be willing to accept? And on that subject of testing, before we go on, I think the other really important thing there is we need to look at testing as something that advances North Korea's capabilities and something that isn't necessarily intended from Pyongyang's perspective to be a provocation, right? If North Korea can test missiles and not get a strong response from the US, from South Korea, from China, and not really provoke anything, not even get our attention, that may actually be a win for Kim, right? So we shouldn't view the potential for weapons testing as necessarily a cry for help, so much as Kim trying to strengthen his position and strengthen his capabilities. I think this paradigm of Kim as kind of a spoiled child seeking attention, that we kind of characterize him like that. I don't think that's really what is in Kim's mind when it comes to weapons testing these days. That might have been an old paradigm, but I think Kim right now, when he tests weapons, he wants to advance capability, not just get attention. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcus. I still think it's just the sequencing is the hard part. Who should go first and how much sanctions relief to give for what. That's just very difficult. Before verification, just the sequencing of things. Professor Kim, your reaction to what Bob and Marcus just talked about, but also if you could comment a little bit, bring China in here. Given deteriorating U.S.-China relations, just current tensions, it's a question whether Biden administration would be able to enlist China's cooperation on this North Korean issue. What kind of pressure we can apply to China? You've heard just recently, a couple of days ago, Alex Wong give a speech about just really hard-hitting speech about Beijing's role, how China is not really implementing UN sanctions and delaying the denuclearization efforts. He in fact noted there were like 555 occasions where where ships suspected of carrying coal or other sanctions goods from North Korea to China without Beijing doing nothing about it. So if you could just talk a little bit about China's role here, that would be great too. Thank you.
Thank you. If I go back to the question about the interim deal, I agree that the interim deal or phase deal would be practical and more realistic, but there is danger as well. By halting the process of action for action, at some point, North Korea wants to be recognized as a nuclear state. In that case, reinstalling the sanctions, according to articles or snapback, is a possibility. It should start. But I doubt whether China and Russia will agree to this or fully adhere to the reinstalled sanctions. In addition, North Korea would have the upper hand in negotiations because it might have accumulated some money and resources during the period of lifted sanctions. That's why we need to carefully design a roadmap to complete denuclearization. Otherwise, a bridge from one action to another one would be broken easily. And as a result, North Korea may become de facto nuclear state. Here, I think comes the role of China. I think it's very important because if we move one action from the other, from one action to the other action, Chinese cooperation is critical. Yes, I understand that China relaxed sanctions after Xi Jinping met Kim Jong-un. I look at what impact of this kind of relaxation on the economy. If you look at the growth rates in 2018 and 19, we know that 2018 was estimated to be minus 4%, but 2019 increased to 0.4%. The reason is partly due to the relaxation sanctions by China. But from Chinese perspective, North Korea matter is kind of a function of the relations with the United States. And so the United States has two equations that have to solve at the same time. One is equation for China, the other one is equation for North Korea. Well, I suggest to simultaneously solve the equations is very difficult. Then why not sequential approach? Let's tackle North Korea first and move on China. Then I think it make easier to concentrate on North Korea matter. And we can be helped by China as well. That is what I would suggest.
Dr. Song, please feel free to comment on what you just heard from Professor Kim on China. But I also want to bring in other regional actors as well, or also about Japan. Just before we conclude, obviously Korea-Japan relations has not been going pretty well at all in the past few years. Do you have a comment on that as well, how the Biden administration could address the tension between Japan and South Korea? But please also feel free to comment on China's role as well.
Okay, with regards to the role of Japan or the Korea-Japan relations, let me start from the Biden administration's foreign policy points. Biden's foreign policy stresses, I think, two things: rebuilding of alliance and returning to multilateralism. One of the expressions of these ideas of the new Biden administration in East Asian context will be trilateral security cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. In doing so, recovery of South Korea and Japan relations is an essential factor. In that sense, a series of visits to Japan by senior South Korean officials, as well as the nomination of a new ambassador to Tokyo. He's a Tokyo University PhD, and he has a very wide web network of security and economy people in China. So this is very desirable move to promote the trilateral security cooperation in East Asia. I think this is what the new Biden administration really hopes and desires in designing and implementing his ideas on the East Asian regional grouping to counter China's rise. There's no doubt. But the problem is, from the Biden administration's point of view, the recent move in South Korea and Japan, the recovery of the relations is definitely a welcome departure from the long-standing diplomatic standard. But one thing I want to point out is my own interpretation that the meaning of trilateral security cooperation, I think the meaning of the trilateral security cooperation is twofold, basically. First one is about Indo-Pacific strategy, probably, who knows, the end of America-led hub and spoke system is over in Asia. And the second one is about the three countries' joint efforts to respond to nuclear threat from North Korea. The problem is that the United States is likely to focus more on the first aspect of the trilateral relationship, which is a regional grouping to counter China's rise. But South Korea feels the second aspect is more immediate task, which is dealing with North Korea by strengthening trilateral security cooperation in East Asia. Political schedule in South Korea and the United States also matters. Many people say that the appointments of the key posts in East Asia policy of the Biden administration will take at least several months. And the North Korea policy review will take another couple of months. But the Moon Jae-in administration has only 1.5 years to go before leaving office. There is a time discrepancy. So I think the trilateral security cooperation among South Korea, the United States, and Japan will depend on how early the trilateral consultation process begins and how intensively they discuss a creative solution for the denuclearization of the denuclearization and regional peace building, and how to involve China in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you so much. So we do have a question, and this question is from Barry. So let me just ask all of you this question. If we ended up in a crisis that threatened to escalate to nuclear use, do we know whether Kim Jong-un shares our views on crisis stability, signaling, and escalation management? How great is the risk of major misunderstandings amid a crisis? Who wants to answer this? Marcus, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I'll hit on it. I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this one in my career and thinking about how to then respond if the situation does start to escalate. And I do think the possibility of miscalculation is very real, but I also think that North Korea intentionally stokes the perception that escalation could very rapidly get out of control by making these statements about essentially early nuclear use and alluding to the potential that even sometimes these statements say, if we see a 1 millimeter intrusion in our territory, then we'll respond with overpowering force, these sorts of statements. So I think it's important to be concerned about miscalculation, but it's also to call North Korea on its bluff in some of these situations. If we're too careful and we draw back too much, then we just encourage more North Korean bad behavior until it gets to the point where they may miscalculate in a big way and cross what essentially is a true red line for us. And especially as their nuclear capability increases, their confidence, Kim's confidence, that because of fears of nuclear retaliation, that we won't respond when Kim does something egregious, that could also be very dangerous. So I think we have to be mindful of the fact that miscalculation could come from both ends, and that it's our sort of lack of response in some cases could actually make things worse and not de-escalate a situation.
Thank you so much. There's one question about economy. So about North Korea's economy, whether we can get the North, first of all, what's going on, and if there's a prospect for reform, if it will be possible for North Korea to follow a Chinese model. I'm going to ask Professor Kim and anybody else to comment on that. Professor Kim.
Yes, that's an important question, but I think the probability of Kim Jong-un's launching the Chinese-style reform, that is transition actually to market economy is low. I examined 7 major reforms implemented in former socialist countries. Only 2 out of 7 went for transition, while the other 5 opted for reform, but within the boundary of socialist principles, but eventually collapsed. In the 2 cases of fundamental reform, a change in political leadership preceded economic transformation. But North Korea is not the case. Having said that, there is a possibility that Kim Jong-un chooses transition to market economy, not voluntarily, but forced by marketization from below. That is quite prevalent in North Korea. Many North Koreans derive their income from market activities. About 70% income comes from market activities. And I found that this marketization transforms North Koreans' social norms, from 주체man to homo economicus. The majority of North Koreans now believe capitalism is better than socialism. Therefore, in this process intensifies, there's some fundamental changes we observed when feudal system transformed into a modern society could occur in North Korea.
Thank you. Marcus, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah,
Quickly?
so I think great points from Dr. Kim about the reasons why the regime wouldn't go to this path of major reform. A couple quick points to add, though. I think one is that the North Korean elite is embedding itself and has been embedding itself into the Chinese economy very deeply. So I think that's really where they're comfortable, not necessarily following the Chinese model, but using China as basically a gateway economically. And shielding from sanctions. And I think the other aspect is this whole question of major economic reform and opening is one of the big reasons why offering North Korea huge economic incentives for denuclearization is just a flawed premise to begin with. The sort of reform and opening that would be required to take full advantage of what the US and South Korea have been offering is an unacceptable risk to the regime. It literally is the carrot and the carrot and stick analogy is poisoned in that way. So I think that's something we got to be realistic about as well.
Great, thank you. We have 1 minute. So Bob, did you want to make a final comment?
Yeah, going back to the issue of an interim agreement and its contents, Marcus is right. It's difficult to get the North Koreans to do a nationwide constraint that's verifiable and so forth. But there's a dilemma for the Biden administration. On the one hand, you want to be realistic, practical, get North Korea on board. On the other hand, you want to have a constraint that is meaningful enough that the American public believes you're really constraining their program. A test ban alone, that would enable the North to continue to expand their program, even limiting a constraint to Yongbyon, the nuclear complex. It would allow the North to continue producing fissile material outside of Yongbyon. It's a difficult issue. That'll be the hardest issue for the Biden administration in deciding the scope of an interim deal. And just finally on China, look, China is critical. I don't think there can be a positive outcome on the Korean Peninsula without China playing a helpful role. It can be a spoiler or it can be a help in achieving a positive outcome. I don't know that we know the answer, whether we can really get China on our side, but it's essential to get some help from China. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Time is, you're talking about timing. Unfortunately, time is up for us. It was too short to cover everything we wanted to discuss, but it was very informative discussion. Thank you to everyone who joined us. It was my privilege to moderate this morning's session on principled diplomacy for a denuclearized North Korea with distinguished colleagues. Thank you to Robert Einhorn, Dr. Byung-Hyun Kim, Marcus Galaskas, and Dr. Kyung Sung. Thank you so much. This concludes the panel.
Good morning, good evening, and good day. My name is Scott Snyder. I'm a senior fellow for Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final session of this Atlantic Council Korea Foundation 2020 forum. And this session is going to cover the US-South Korea economic partnership beyond the peninsula. We have an excellent panel with us to discuss these issues. Two officials and two non-officials. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. First, we have Dr. Duk-Gun An, who is a professor of international trade law and policy at Seoul National University. Professor An has taught all over the world. He has advised many different editorial journals, and also he has advised in many different capacities on economic issues with the government of the Republic of Korea. Our second panelist is Mr. Mark Napper, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan at the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs of the U.S. Department of State. He is a career diplomat who has played many roles in Asia policy and is an excellent linguist, but the role that I think is probably maybe most notable is that Mr. Napper was the senior American official during the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympic Games based in Seoul. And I just think that that must have been a real career highlight. Our third panelist is Deputy Chief of Mission Moon Sung-hyun of the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the United States. He also is a career foreign ministry official, has most recently served as ambassador to the Czech Republic, has served in the Blue House and in many different positions within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including at the UN in New York. And then our final panelist is Dr. Myun Oh, who really needs no introduction as the Chief Director of the Asia Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. And she has been doing a lot of work on US-China competition and implications for US allies and partners, and also economic issues and economic architecture in the Asia Pacific. So she is perfect as a panelist for this panel. And I want to start with our officials, and I want to ask, against the backdrop of the pandemic and intensified US-China rivalry, just give us a situation rep with regards to the US-South Korea alliance and the economic partnership, and where the opportunities might be for the US and South Korea to deepen or expand economic cooperation. And let me ask Mr. Napper to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Good morning, everybody. And thank you especially to the Atlantic Council and the Korea Foundation for this opportunity. It's really great to be here this morning. And it's a great question, certainly one that is being raised a lot these days. And I would just, I guess, frame my answer in terms of my own experience with Korea. I started off, my first assignment was in Seoul in the early 90s. And at that time, our relationship with the South was really limited to our security partnership, naturally focused on deterring and in the event, heaven forbid, that we had to, defending against North Korean aggression. But as Korea has grown and as Korea's prominence on the world stage has increased, so too has the breadth and depth of the U.S.-Korea relationship also grown. And I think, so whereas in the early 90s, it was a very peninsula-focused relationship, I think look at today, this is a global alliance. This is a global relationship. We've seen as Korea has grown into the world's, by some estimations, the 10th largest economy in the world. Our relationship has become one in which investment and trade flows are more intense than ever. We've got terrific investment, Korean investment in the United States, creating great jobs for Americans. We've got Korea is one of our top, in fact, it's the #1 importer of American liquefied natural gas, one of our top petroleum importers. We're very proud of the fact that we can provide energy security to South Korea. This is a part of our broader security relationship of trade. Korea is our, I think, 6th largest trading partner. Against the backdrop of the COVID pandemic, our health partnership has really blossomed, thanks to Korea, really in our time of need in the spring. We received 750,000 test kits. We received PPE. And so, I mean, these are all just examples of how this relationship is flourishing. It's going from strength to strength. It's proving to be one of our it is one of our best and most resilient partners. And so in spite of everything that's going on in the world, I think this is really a relationship about which we can be proud. And I'm confident that in the months and years ahead, it will continue to grow as one of our strongest and best alliances in the region.
Okay, so economic dimension of the relationship as a growth area. DCM Moon, can I turn to you to get your take? You might have to unmute. Okay.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Scott, and thank you, Mark Knepper, for your opening statement. And I agree with you that ROK-US relationship has tremendously expanded over the last several decades. And then, but still we have many challenges lies ahead. Like one of them, as mentioned, that is how we can respond to the pandemic. So that, but before I'm going into that, what kind of the task that Korea and the United States need to handle together in the years to come. But I would just explain that where our economic partnership stands. First, let me explain that KOROS FTA. While I worked in the Washington DC about 10 years ago, I just witnessed that how it was passed in the US Congress so that it became effective in 2012. So that since then, our economic, our trade volume expanded 7 times in 7 years. 25% increase in 7 years. So that now it is working as a driving force for the future of the bilateral economic relationship. And also, that Mark mentioned about trade and the investment that, but before, I said so that I think Korea is currently the United States' 6th largest trading partners. When I saw this statistic, I was a little bit surprised. Who is those other 5 countries before Korea? So I found that Mexico and Canada, we understand that in the context of 3 countries in free trade, and then China, then Japan and Germany. Then Korea ranked 6th largest trading partner to the United States. At the same time, one of the good aspect of our bilateral economic relationship is that our trade account is more or less kind of balanced. In the past, this is one area for the criticism from the United States. But now when you look at the data in the year of the 2019, Korea had a surplus of $11.5 billion in goods, while the United States had $10.3 billion surplus in services. So that this is also good kind of development. We have like lots of the investment into the United States. Like in the past, the United States more invested into Korea, but now when I look at the data that Korea's investment to the United States doubled that of the United States investment to Korea. So that all these, statistics provides that how our economic partnership is solid and sound in a sense. But as I mentioned at the beginning, that we also, need to look at the challenges in the ahead. Then I would like to outline kind of three major tasks that we need to work on for our upgraded economic cooperation. One is that the first task is that to have as rapid an economic recovery as possible from the ongoing pandemic. Korea has been relatively successful in dealing with the COVID-19. Our economy is expected to shrink only by 1.1% this year, the best rate among the OECD countries. Our government has enacted 4 supplementary stimulus packages this year, totaling $280 billion. This is part of our government effort to support the domestic consumption, provide safety net to the vulnerable people under the umbrella of the Korea New Deal policy. But Korea's economy cannot be separated from the global recovery. So we agree with the statement made at the recent G20 summit, which made it clear that countries need to adopt vigorous and well-coordinated fiscal and monetary measures. So coordination is actually key in addressing this pandemic. As you know, that throughout the pandemic, Korea has maintained regular foreign and vice foreign ministers meetings with 6 other countries, including the United States. And we also have increased the contacts between health and financial authorities. The current swap agreement with the United States early this year was one such good example. Going forward, cooperation should also better address the pandemic at the regional and global level and include planning on how to prevent future pandemic. We are very interested in expanding our cooperation into such area, not only from the economic, but also from the strategic perspective. Our second task is that to rebuild and strengthen regional and global trade architecture to be more effective. About 2 weeks ago, Korea, Japan, China, along with the 12 other Asian countries, signed the RCEP, the biggest FTA ever concluded. On the other hand, there are debates on expanding CPTPP 11, including the possibility of the United States joining. I think these are all important steps for the future of trade and economics in Asia. We hope that the United States is more involved in the regional economic architecture, and we are supportive of it. I also would like to recognize the recent efforts of both governments to link each strategy, Korea's new Southern policy and the United States Indo-Pacific strategy in this region. On the global level, I think there is a clear need for WTO reform. Korea and the United States share the view that the United States should be more effective, WTO should be more effective and responsive. In this context, we are very grateful to the US strong support to our candidate to the post of the WTO Secretary General. Korea is also interested in how the post-COVID-19 economics order will be formulated and how Korea will fit into it. We welcome the indication from the President Trump that he would invite Korea, Australia, and India to this year's G7 meeting, though it's not likely to happen. Whatever the future economic order looks like, we believe that it should be rule-based, open, and transparent. Korea has concluded the FTAs with 56 countries, and our economy is well connected with most of the world. We are willing to work with the United States to contribute freer trade and global prosperity. Finally, I would like to emphasize, the need to harmonize economic interest with our strategy and security consideration. In today's world, economics and security are closely interconnected. So that when it comes to the future technologies, particularly security aspect in economic activity should be given due attention. Considering Korea and the United States share values and our relations are strongly buttressed by alliance, so there will be more that we can do together as a reliable partner. These issues involve many other bigger topics, including the strategic competition between the United States and China. I assume that the current views on China in the United States will continue to evolve even after the change in the US administration. This will pose many challenges to many countries, including Korea. I don't know what will be the best option for us, but at least Korea and the United States need to engage more with each other to have honest and strategic dialogue on this topic also. I will stop here.
Okay, great. Well, DCM Moon, you did an excellent job of essentially laying out the agenda for the rest of our session that I want to drill down on. But I want to really start by turning to the last point you made about the impacts of China-US major power rivalry. And yesterday we heard in the keynote, Kurt Campbell talking about competing with China where we must and cooperating where we, or says competing where we must, cooperating where we can. And I want to turn to Dr. An and ask about the emerging trend of decoupling in the global economy and how you see the US-South Korea economic relationship in that context.
Yeah, the US-China rivalry and the decoupling issue is probably the foremost prominently portrayed in the digital trade war now. As you know, the Secretary Pompeo announced the Clean Network project, and the Chinese government actually again reacted by announcing digital security initiative. Korea is kind of squeezed here, but in fact, we are prepared to participate in the alliance driven by the US government. For the digital trade bloc, which has been strengthened more and more, is actually key driver of decoupling problems. We don't see serious decoupling phenomenon in other traditional manufacturing areas. Actually, the decoupling problem is mostly focused on the digital and IT industry sector. As you know, Korea is now in the process to conclude basically the first ever the digital trade agreement with Singapore. So Korea-Singapore Digital Partnership Agreement is in the process. We are benchmarking currently at the CPTPP level, but we know that already the USMCA or US-Japan digital trade agreement or the two other trade economic agreement driven by Singapore with the Australia or New Zealand, Chile, we try to find a way to upgrade the current negotiation. The original plan was by the end of this year, we try to build the first stepping stone to join this global digital effort. We will see soon how much we can prepare. Currently, it doesn't seem to be quite advanced as opposed to the very recent digital trade agreement, but we are trying. So as you know, again, as I mentioned, the current Korean government announced the Digital New Deal project, and the digital trade agreement is a very important element to set forth basically the industry infrastructure, the industry environment for this digital industry sector. We just finished the RCEP negotiation, as you know, but unfortunately, RCEP has a lot of limitations. For example, the digital trade chapter included in RCEP agreement is actually not covered by the dispute settlement provision, which means practically speaking, we cannot ensure the enforceability of this the first commitment. So starting from the Korea-Singapore Digital Partnership Agreement, we try to prepare ourselves to join the major digital initiative by the US government.
So let me just ask a follow-up there, because you mentioned the Singapore-Korea Digital Trade Agreement and RCEP. And I'm wondering whether you think that digital trade is going to end up being a global standard, or do you think that it's going to end up being an area of competition between the United States and China to define the standard?
In my opinion, the latter. Unlike the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the US mobilized the global community to establish the World Trade Organization and then to set forth a new services trade rule. One of the most prominent difference I observe is to prepare the digital transformation now. It seems like the major economies to try to strengthen the digital economic bloc. So clearly, the digital economic bloc centered on the US and Japan and joined by the Canada, Mexico, and probably, we don't know yet, but the Biden administration may try to revive the Biden version of TPP. So I see the gradually strengthening the digital trades, the economic unity will work basically against the China. So I see in this area, we will encounter more and more serious and fierce competitions between two major powers, I guess.
Okay, so now I want to transition to Dr. O and ask about this emerging competition in digital trade and what it might mean for economic priorities for the Biden administration as related to US-South Korea economic relations.
Thank you, Scott. Since our distinguished speakers already talked about a lot of things, including digitalization, I'd like to start with saying that President-elect Biden said that he will host a summit of democracy during his first year to build a coalition with like-minded countries to respond to the threat of authoritarian regimes. And as you pointed out earlier, Campbell also said during his keynote speech yesterday that the Biden administration is likely to compete and control China through a broader set of arrangements with allies and partners. I think US allies and partners will want to know how much Biden's China policy will be different from and similar with that of Trump's, and how the administration is going to identify areas of conflicting versus common interest with China. And with the changing geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape, US policy toward China will have significant implications for how these allies and partners, including South Korea, in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, reevaluate and adjust their own China policies and strategies, which will also likely reshape China's strategy toward the United States. And I'd like to just talk about the areas of just potential cooperation or the areas of strengthened cooperation between US-ROK, and would like to talk about technology and innovation. I think two countries can and should cooperate, develop more secure artificial intelligence AI. Korea has hardware strengths in AI, whereas US has software strengths. And this really could create an opportunity to help secure both the hardware and software supply chains for AI by relying more on one another. The next, I think the Korea and US government should work together to facilitate deeper US-ROK private sector partnerships on autonomous vehicles. While Hyundai is leading this development in Korea as a leading car manufacturer, the US has comparative advantage in software technology such as AI, sensors, and logic chips. And key examples of cooperation between Korean and American firms include Hyundai Adaptive and Hyundai Aurora as joint ventures. but there is no ongoing government-led cooperation between the two countries since they held a meeting in July 2019 to discuss cooperation in the sector. And I think collaboration at the government level to establish shared mechanisms such as safety standards vehicles will be important to make it easier for the US and Korean firms to jointly develop autonomous technologies. And I like to just mention on 5G infrastructure that I think the two countries can cooperate to promote responsible global development and deployment of 5G infrastructure. And I know, I understand that the issue of 5G and the US-China technology competition present Korea's growing dilemma that Korean firms are likely to gain in terms of global market shares in the 5G related industries from Huawei's lost share in the long term, which will be at the expense of the short-term business and growth from Huawei and other Chinese tech firms. And while Korea would like to wait and see Biden's policy on Huawei and other technologies, the US, Korea can and should consider establishing a steering committee. I think this could be one of the ideas that consists of experts from industries and policy community to offer a platform to discuss how to reconcile national security concerns with economic security. And this bilateral effort could eventually be linked to emerging multilateral effort to coordinate the world 10 leading democracies, so-called the D10 on 5G. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. O put a lot on the table for us, and I want to follow up with our officials because she's really talking about the government's framing new technology development as an area of cooperation while the private sector is used to competing to develop those issues. And so I'm just curious from first DCM Moon and then Mr. Napper, how do you see private sector willingness to participate in coordination with the government to try to cooperate on emerging technologies? And we'll start with DCM Moon.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Scott. And then before I'm going to answer that question, I would like make one point to Dr. Han said concerning that this kind of the technological grouping of the countries. Recently, I read an article carried in the Foreign Affairs. Mr. I think Cohen wrote, which is talking about so-called like a T12, the concept of T12. So that G7 countries minus Italy plus Korea, Australia, and India and Israel can participate in that kind of grouping. So that when I just read that article, I just was reminded that there are lots of discussions concerning that this kind of grouping to address the kind of the technological issues or competition between the United States and China. So that later that I would like to listen to the views of the Dr. An, even if, that I can see that the necessity for the kind of the technological trade blocks and others, in our competition vis-a-vis China. But I'm just wondering how much it can be feasible considering so interconnectedness of all the economies with China. So that later, after that I can listen to the views of the Dr. Han on that point. And in terms of this, the technologies, actually yesterday I had a dinner with one of the top Korean conglomerates delegation to Washington, D.C. And then I had a chance to discuss about, how we can, government and then business community can work together in this field. So that as you know that this year, Korea made lots of the investment into the United States. For example, that Samsung in Texas, Lotte in Louisiana, LG in Michigan, SK in Georgia. So that this, I mean, a big conglomerate in Korea try to start, I mean, to be aligned with the United States in developing these top technologies, including electronic battery for the electronic cars, and then other ICT related products and so on. So that definitely what I'm talking to this delegation, that I feel like there is strong need for the government and the business circle work together in the case of Korea. Not only, I mean, that to attain the kind of edge in this competition, but also, I mean, to kind of the positions Korea in the situation where the United States and China competition is becoming serious. So that definitely, I mean, there will be more area for the government and the business circle need to work together. But there is kind of the consensus in the Korean government that I mean, that while government is working its own role, but at the same time we need to work together with the business circle in this field. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm actually hearing from you is that the private sectors, to some extent, are already aligning, making it much easier for governments to coordinate that alignment. Is that the way that you see it, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we benefit, our relationship, whether it's public sector, private sector, we benefit from a really long-standing history of cooperation, from basic science to research and development, and some of these emerging and sort of top-line technologies, whether it's 5G, AI, quantum sciences, nanotechnology, applications such as autonomous vehicles. I mean, these are all areas in which both, government to government, but also in the private sectors, we have a long-standing cooperative relationship, and one that, I foresee going forward. I mean, because frankly, it comes down to the kind of values and principles our two countries share in terms of, transparency and openness and support for innovation and commitment to fostering a digital economy in which data is able to flow freely but also securely. And so there's absolutely, I think going forward, a role for the United States and Korea to work together, especially as we work on standards and setting global standards. I think these will be really important, and not just between ourselves, but partnering with like-minded countries like Japan, like Australia, the EU, India, Canada. I mean, these are all partners with whom we share, I think, a common goal of ensuring that the standards of these technologies that will shape the next century are ones that do promote openness, transparency, and help to undergird our democratic values.
Okay, great. Now I want to turn to Dr. An, really to answer DCM Moon's question about the competing trends in the global economy and as related to China, between economic interdependence and decoupling. But I'd like to ask you to put this into a global trade perspective, because we see signs of illiberalization in the global economy. I know that you are a WTO specialist, and so I'd be interested in your view on how is this going to play out in terms of the emphasis on economic interdependence on the one hand, and the sets of entanglements that already exist versus this impulse for decoupling with China.
Yeah, in my opinion, I think on the one hand, it's thanks to the technology development, especially like a smart factory. Smart factory has been quite widely disseminated, and that significantly reduced the production cost. So that actually economically support the reshoring phenomena. On the one hand, the reshoring has been strongly pushed by the very strong government policy, and also the Corona and the US-China trade conflict. But economically, actually, it works nowadays because of the smart factory technology. So digitization, IT technology development, it all reduced significantly the production costs in the advanced the economies. on the other hand, we are seeing the market hugely divided. Well, the economists and a lot of business community nowadays talked about the collapse of the global value chain and the emergence of the regional value chain. I think the production process-wise, the maintaining global value chain becomes too risky. So now the industry sector trying to adjust to the current situation, political situation, and the medical situation to reduce the production cost. And on the other hand, the companies try to go to the marketplace. So global market seems to be divided. So now in the technology, the intense the sector, especially the more broadly we term as digital economic sector, the market seems to be clearly divided in major the purchasing power area. So U.S. Driven market, and then probably the EU area, and then the China area will be gradually reshuffled. But in here, the political element is also intervened. So probably US and European unions try to solidify its relationship between these two economies. But in that phenomenon, probably the Chinese economy will feel more and more marginalized from this integrated sector, especially if you observe what is included in the recent digital trade agreement. It started with like a data free flow and the sub-localization provision and so forth. But nowadays they try to include even the submarine cable systems and AI provisions, the blockchain stuff. So they try to fortify the economic integration in this area with basically like-minded or like-situated and strategic partners.
Okay, great. Now there are two areas that I think we really need to dig in on. One is related to Southeast Asia, and in particular, US-Korea economic cooperation in the context of alignment of the Indo-Pacific and new Southern policies, and the other is the regional trade architecture. And so I want to turn to Dr. Oh to get her take on the progress that has been made in terms of alignment of these two policies. We know that there's been joint fact sheets released indicating an intent to cooperate between the US and South Korea in Southeast Asia in energy and infrastructure, finance and development. Digital economy has been mentioned. We also know that BRI is out there. But what I'm really interested in is it seems like the US has a geopolitical rationale and South Korea has a geoeconomic rationale for pursuing this cooperation. And so how do you see these two fitting together? Are we really on the same page in terms of our cooperation in Southeast Asia, and what are the opportunities and challenges?
Thank you, Scott. And I'm sure that DevNetber and DCM Moon also has a lot to share on this topic. But I would like to, I think I can say that I actually have an upcoming report on US ROK efforts under this New Southern Policy and Indo-Pacific Strategy, which try to provide an overview of the current status, where priorities of the two countries converge and diverge, and what that means for the future joint regional engagement. And, as you mentioned from the joint fact sheet, the two countries were able to make a lot of progress on security and people-related issues such as a pandemic response and cybersecurity and so on. I see that two countries were not able to make much progress in terms of the bilateral cooperation on economic engagement, partially due to the COVID-19, but because of the US-China tensions. And My report assesses that this is mainly due to the relative difficulty that linking US and ROK economic effort reflects the core challenges of coordinating strategic priorities on key issues with regard to China's rise, including 5G technology, infrastructure, maritime security, and more. But I see that there are still clear overlapping areas of economic engagement between the two countries, like said, and include energy, digital economy, and information communication technology that Dr. An said a lot. And I try to offer some policy recommendations for the two countries. And overall, the key is to target priority countries and issue areas to maximize the impact of the cooperation. From the in-depth research for my report, I find that Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore are countries that the US ROK should consider joint project for high visibility rather than spreading limited sources to thin. Focus effort in targeted countries and projects could maximize mutual benefits of engagement. And also, I think it is really essential to deploy public messaging that effectively conveys existing efforts and the importance of the further cooperative efforts. For instance, their US ROK and with ASEAN countries, they've been already working on 5G in the region, but I don't think many people are aware of that ongoing effort. So first, I'd like to talk about energy, and I see energy has a great potential for enhanced cooperation by establishing a mechanism for forging public-private partnership that can bolster specific ongoing lines of effort, such as LNG in Vietnam and renewable energy in Indonesia. On infrastructure, I argue for operationalizing the US ROK infrastructure financing MOUs by identifying and pursuing a serious signature high visibility infrastructure project that link US financing capacity with ROK construction capacity, and exploring those opportunities for expanding to work with multiple stakeholders such as Japan and Australia under existing or new multilateral framework through a joint pilot program is also a key. And on the digital economy, Dr. An already covered a lot. And I know that as I mentioned earlier, there's a different views on 5G and which is a challenge, but there are still key opportunities for cooperative efforts on digital economy in Southeast Asia, including prioritizing joint effort on digital connectivity in targeted countries like Indonesia, which has huge potential of market growth of this industry. And while working, and also Dr. An mentioned Singapore is a key in-region partner for developing a platform for regional-wide US ROK ASEAN digital trade policy. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. O. And now I'm going to turn back to our officials. I don't want to sound critical in any way, but I would say that what Dr. O described sounds to me at least like it's very aspirational at this point. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how far down that road have we been able to get and where are the most promising opportunities for moving forward? And I'll start with DAS Napper.
Okay, thanks. And I'll just at the top say that I think it sounds like Dr. O's report's going to have a lot of good ideas and advice for us. So we look forward to seeing that. But you know, when President Moon first rolled out his new Southern policy, I guess it's more than a year ago, you know, its focus on the three pillars therein of peace, people, and prosperity, you know, seemed to us like a perfect fit with our own Indo-Pacific strategy, which of course has as its principles of openness, inclusiveness, transparency, good governance, respect for international norms, focus on ASEAN centrality. And so these are all areas that form the foundation of our efforts to coordinate better our own Indo-Pacific strategy with the new Southern policy. And so, I mean, certainly, yeah, I mean, lots of aspirations, but we've been really pleased. Just over the summer, we had our very first dialogue for our two efforts, the Indo-Pacific strategy and the new Southern policy. And the dialogue focused on cyber security cooperation, focused on law enforcement cooperation, focused on cooperation in the Pacific Islands. And then we hope to have soon another working group on cooperation in Southeast Asia. And so there have been some fruits of this effort. Last last year, we were able to convene in Singapore a workshop between the United States and South Korea, in which we helped to educate cyber experts among ASEAN countries on 5G and concerns surrounding 5G and the use of untrusted vendors like Huawei and ZTE. We've been working together on water management projects along the Mekong, so the Mekong River countries in Southeast Asia. How best to manage water resources is another area in which the US and South Korea are working together. But yeah, we do have big goals. I think one of the significant sort of fruits of this effort, though, has been in ways that we haven't before, but bringing together our two sort of interagencies. And so when we had this dialogue over the summer, we had various working groups focused, as I said, on cybersecurity, law enforcement, Pacific Islands, and we had, on our side, groups that had really never, or organizations, agencies, departments that had never really dealt with their Korean counterparts. And it was really useful, not just for us to come together virtually, of course, to see each other and work together on these issues, but also to see our Korean counterparts and work together with them for the first time. So, we are at the beginning. We have had some good successes so far, but really we're looking forward to continuing to grow this and expand it, because I think the areas of our shared interests, again, whether it's good governance, whether it's promoting sort of open and transparent sort of systems of trade and digital economy, these are all things that we share and we'll continue to work together to promote.
Okay, well, that's a great answer. And I really appreciate hearing about the move from whole of government to whole of alliance approaches in this area. I would not underestimate the significance of making a start on that. DCM Moon, your view.
Thank you, Mark, for your detailed explanation of that, how, this two initiatives of the both countries have developed in last year and this year. I have actually 3 comments on it that, as Scott outlined at the beginning, that our new Southern policy is more or less focused on geo-economic aspect of our closer relationship with the Southeast Asian countries. That is also part of our kind of the decoupling from too much dependence on Chinese market, with the Chinese with a trading relationship with China. So that our focus is more as a geo-economic aspect. While when I look at the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, definitely it also has, the economic aspect, but it also emphasizes kind of geostrategic aspect of that initiative by the United States. So the dilemma is that how we can combine those, two aspects, like geo-economic and the geopolitical aspect of both initiatives. Having said that, I would like to say that, as just Mark mentioned, that we are in kind of the beginning stage, how we can cooperate deeper in these two strategies. But particularly, that what Korea tried to focus on is that we try to build up the kind of the pilot project that where Korea can be strong, or like where the United States can be strong, so that we have 2 areas particularly we focus on. One is that the capacity building in those countries, because without capacity building, any other cooperation or any other support to those countries will not be sustainable. And second is that we also want to focus on more strategic use of our development assistance. That is topic that we have discussed with the United States a lot. Particularly, that Korea's the development assistance to these areas is quite huge. In the case of the Vietnam is the #1 country to receive the biggest share of our ODA. But when I look at also Indo-Pacific islands, that is also very critical area where Korea and the United States deepen our cooperation. That finally, when we look at this new Southern policy and then Indo-Pacific strategy by the United States, is that we also take into consideration the Chinese factors in this region, so that China is also very much strong and very much active in this region of the world. So that while we are working together with the United States, we also need to how Chinese are working in this field. So that in that regard, I just want to add just one more point. That is that we also need to include, Japan in our bilateral combining strategy. So that how we can, the Korea and the United States can work together with Japan also to promote, our ultimate agenda of the prosperity and peace in this region of the world. Thank you.
Okay, I really want to commend DCM on the proactive mention of Japan, but we've only got a few minutes left, so this is the lightning round question about the future of the regional trade architecture from each of the panelists, because we have RCEP with Korea in and new opportunities for cooperation in Northeast Asia. We have CPTPP with the US and South Korea on the outside looking in. And we have a partnership between the US and South Korea. So what can the US and South Korea do together in order to help shape the regional trade architecture? And I'll start with Dr. An. 1 minute each, please.
For a long time, the Korea boasted about the Korea-US FTA as one of the most advanced FTA, but at this moment, it is quite outdated. So we are also very keen to upgrade the economic relationship with the United States. So I believe, I hope the Biden administration will initiate the major economic endeavor to reorganize the Biden version of TPP, and probably will significantly upgrade the level of the regulatory integration as well as economic and commercial cooperation. So in there, I believe Korea will strongly work together with the US government.
Okay, Dr. Oh, your view.
Thank you. I just wanted to just quote the Fred Kem, CEO and President of the Atlantic Council, and what he wrote at his weekly newsletter, Inflection Point. So he said RCEP is a wake-up call for Biden about declining US leadership, and that the Biden administration should begin by studying where there is an accelerated path to rejoining TPP or CPTPP. And I just wanted to flag one thing. So Beijing, after signing the RCEP, wants to resume a trilateral FTA with Japan and Korea, which has stalled over bilateral dispute for several years. And if that comes true, 3 Asian countries account for about 24% of the world economy, with a combined yearly trading volume of over $720 billion US, and forming one of the most integrated international economic bloc. So I totally agree with Dr. An. So US version of TPP, and then Korea also can consider joining TPP.
DCM Moon.
Thank you, Scott. Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping mentioned Chinese intention to join in CPTPP 11, so that as Dr. Oh mentioned, that there should be a wake-up call to the United States. Even Korea is only, the member of the RCEP, but based on, ROK US free trade agreement, I think we can work together to contribute more in rebuilding regional economic and trade order with the United States. But here, what we need is that the leadership of the United States, so that hopefully, the new administration in the United States can be involved more in this discussion in the future. Thank you.
DS Napper, it seems like DCM Moon has served it up to you.
All right, thank you. Batting cleanup. So yeah, I think that, this administration, we've been very focused on ensuring that we've got high quality bilateral free trade agreements, whether it's the updated chorus, whether it's phase 1 with Japan. And certainly we want to continue to use these agreements to expand trade and investment opportunities bilaterally, but also hopefully leverage these agreements to ensure that we've got free and reciprocal trade across the region. Thank you.
Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes left. And so actually I want to just switch over and conclude the session and turn it over to Dr. O for closing remarks for today's panels.
Thank you, Scott, and for leading a fantastic discussion. And thank you to all speakers for making the panel a truly compelling conversation. And let me just say thank you to all of our speakers from this year's Atlantic Council Korea Foundation Forum for their cutting-edge analysis and actionable policy recommendation that I know will help strengthen the US-ROK alliance further under the incoming US administration. I'd like to extend our special thanks to the president of the Korea Foundation, Dr. Lee Gun, for continuing our important partnership at such a challenging but important time. And I look forward to next year's forum, by which time I hope we can all be together in person again. In closing, I hope Dr. Lee Gun doesn't mind if I borrow his quote from yesterday, which I'm sure will be popular soon here in Washington. He said, stay positive, test negative. So everyone, thank you and goodbye.